Hello and welcome to Chapter 8 on memory. That's it. Just kidding. We're going to be talking about memory today, a very fascinating part of the field of psychology, because as much as we experience it every day, as much as memory is actually who we are, and when we formulate and construct an identity of ourselves, it's based on our memories of everything that happened before us. And everybody knows that in the Chamber of Secrets, when Lockhart did the whole memory spell and it bounced back on him and he lost all his memories, he lost all of his identity. So for you Harry Potter fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let's get into Chapter 8 on memory. So we begin with this little graphic here. This is a graphic from one of my favorite Pixar animated, now classic movies called Inside Out, which featured characters that were the emotions inside of the little girl's mind, and most of the movie was about the interaction between those emotions. The really cool thing about that particular movie is it was pretty accurate. And this graphic right here, this portrays memory storage. It's massive. It's almost, and the way they did the animation, the way they actually drew these, it's sort of like the convolutions of the brain. You can see how careful the animators were in trying to replicate reality with the brain. When we talk about emotion, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the individual characters of the primary emotions. And it's actually a really good movie. At the end of the movie, when you watch the credits, you can see a bunch of psychologists were actually consulted on that. And they tried to remain true to all the different aspects of cognition in that movie. So go and watch it. So here's a representation of long-term memory, each one of those little balls representing a different memory, and how they're connected to each other in groups and whatnot, and the different colors representing that. Just a really interesting graphic representation of what could be our long-term memory. Now, a lot of what we understand about memory is in its infancy, to tell you the truth, but we do understand that there are parts of the brain that are associated with memory formation and recall. And here's the graphic right out of the course book here. And we have, I'll just go around from the top right here, many regions of the cortex. This is the outer wrinkly area of the brain are involved in short and long-term semantic and episodic memory. We'll get into defining what those are shortly. The cerebellum, little cauliflower-shaped looking object at the base of the back of our brain, is actually where we store procedural memory. These are things like riding a bike. So those very solid memories that we have are stored in the cerebellum. The medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, is very much responsible for long-term semantic and episodic memory. Semantic memory being the naming of objects, and episodic memory being our biographical, our autobiographical memory when we remember events. And then we have the amygdala here. This is part of the emotional center of the brain. It's in the middle of the brain that we call the mammalian brain, because it is shared with all mammals, is the emotional memory. And this is let's say the sensations or particular visual representations that elicit emotions. Now, the amygdala is really being examined closely right now as sort of the epicenter for conditions like PTSD, where there's a vision or a smell or a sound or whatever that could elicit the same sort of emotional responses as a previous trauma. And they're looking at the amygdala as the culprit in there. We're supposed to have that, but it's going a little wild. And so some of the treatments are targeting the amygdala. And finally, also in terms of procedural memory, we have the striatum putamen. This is right, it's just like just posterior to the amygdala. Again, still part of that emotional aspect, the motivation aspect of memory, and we'll see some procedural memory actually being constructed there as well. Now we move into the first aspect of memory. Before I show you the whole model, I want to talk to you about sensory memory. Now sensory memory, as you're going to see when I show the whole model, is the first point when you have information coming into you. It goes through the organs of sensation, let's say your eyes, your ears, your sense of touch, your temperature, pain, and all these things. And there's a part of the memory process that exists within those actual neurons, within, let's say, the eye. So we're looking at neurons within the retina of the eye. Light hits the back of the retina, it activates those neurons, and those neurons stay active for a little period of time. And then there's a slow decay. And yet we see in terms of the decay here, visual information will stay activated on the back of the retina for about half a second. Audio information remains there for about 3 seconds. Tactile, 10 seconds. Before that, signal decays. And we could probably kind of experience this if we think about when we hear something, we might continue to sense it for a little longer. And certainly when we feel something, we're still getting that information from the neurons going to our brain. This is the part of the sensory process, the sensory emotion, because there's always motivation involved. Memory process is when we see something, hear something, feel something, it indicates that we might want to attend it. And we only have a short period of time to switch our attendance to that. If we fail to do that, for whatever reason, we'll miss that visual information. So visual illusions, let's say a magician, okay, can work. It's easier to work with visual illusions than it is to work with auditory illusions, because auditory illusions hang around for a while. There's not a whole lot of magic tricks associated with hearing and touching. It's all visual, because if we miss it, it's gone very, very quickly within our visual system, because our sensory memory is just holding on to that for a little bit of time, just enough for us to pay attention. So if we're looking at something, and you probably understand that you have to be bead-eye on that. If you like to learn by watching people doing things, you feel really comfortable with that, you watch them, and I'm sure you've adapted to be very, very, very vigilant, and you just keep your eye on them, and you're looking at every step, and it's storing that information, and you have to keep looking at them because you don't want to miss anything, because the decay is really, really fast. If you like sitting back and listening to lectures, that's a little bit easier. And of course, hands-on learning is easiest because it hangs around for a while. See this sort of logic in the different ways that we might approach learning, either visually, auditorily, or tactily, and we'll see why some of them are really easier than others for some folks. Of course, the way we approach information to learn really depends on the type of information we're trying to learn. It's really hard to have, hands-on learning about molecules when you can't even see them, let alone handle them. But you might like building models, or like visualizing it, or write a song about it if you like those kinds of things. But nonetheless, here we have this process here, sensory memory, and we have to attend to it. This is that first step in the memory process. So we have attention that is alternating between stimuli. It is divided. It can be focused. We have selective visual attention. We focus our eyes on things. That's different than the ears. We don't really, animals, their ears move and they can actually focus their hearing the way we focus our vision, but we don't have that. We turn, we might get some orientation to sound or whatever, but it's not nearly as developed as in the animals that can actually focus their hearing on a particular area. For us, vision, we have to focus, and that's why we focus. And when we talk about the vision system, when we talk in sensation and perception, we talk about the different ways that eyes move in order to accomplish this task very rapidly, because the signal is going to be lost very, very quickly, within half a second. So we have these mechanisms in place. So attention is very, very important. And so what we get is this, right at this point, we can start talking about attention deficit. Now, if a person has a condition or medication or lack of sleep or whatever that is getting in the way of them alternating between stimuli, having divided attention and still being productive, focusing, selective visual, and sustaining their attention onto something. If they have anything that's getting in the way of that, it is getting in the way of memory. And ultimately, memory is the important thing for learning. So if we're going to have experiences that embed themselves in our brain and we can recall them later, kind of a way we can talk about learning, then we need to attend to them. Remember when we were talking about learning and we mentioned Pavlov's experiment, the bell was considered a neutral stimulus because it didn't elicit salivation in the dog in the classical conditioning experiment. But you might have heard me mention that it caught their attention. It is something that was loud enough. He actually never used a bell. He used a buzzer and he used lights. But anyway, you have the bell ringing and the dogs would pay attention to it. They could hear it and they would attend to it, unless they had attention deficit dogs, and then they wouldn't. And if they did, if any of his dogs had attention deficit disorder, they would have had difficulty attending to the bell, and therefore the classical conditioning process of pairing the bell with the food would have been interfered with, and they would have been slow learners. They wouldn't have got as quickly as their non-attention deficit peers, the other dogs that didn't have. So let's take a look at this. So we have attention deficit is considered a learning disability because it interferes with memory at this sensory level in terms of attending kind of things. And just while we're talking about learning disabilities, let's get that definition out here. A learning disability is a poor performance despite normal or above normal intelligence. Learning disability is not the same as developmental disabilities, which are global. A person with developmental disabilities has deficits in many, many areas. A person with a learning disability, it might be razor sharp on just one thing. They might have dyslexia or dyscalculia, and they have a problem with reading, and they have a problem with math, but they don't seem to have problems anywhere else. In fact, they can even excel in other areas, but just that one area is what's giving them some trouble. So here we are talking about memory, and we've already talked about how the importance of attendance. We're explaining how attending is important in the learning process. It's this first step, and we're connecting deficits in that ability to attending to what we call learning disability. So attention deficit disorder being one of many learning disabilities. Okay, so let's look at the whole model here. This is the entire model that we have. This comes from the, in truth, it comes from the information processing perspective, I guess, in psychology, which is interesting. It's philosophically interesting, and excuse me if I go off in a little philosophical jaunt here, but we look at when we're examining the human brain, the information processing perspective uses the model of a computer, the way we understand a computer works. And so we can talk about inputs, outputs, data processing, programs, just schemas, ideas, the way routines that we go through, the way we actually solve problems, and short-term memory, RAM, long-term memory, hard drive. We can talk about that as an analogy. The interesting thing, the philosophical interesting thing is that here we are, the creator of this computer, and we're looking closely at the computer to understand ourselves. It's interesting that a creator can look to its creation to understand itself. I think that could lead, with the right people sitting around enjoying each other's company, that could lead to an all-night conversation. So just, if you ever have the opportunity to the creator turning to their creation to understand themselves, I think that's a very, very cool thing to consider. So here we have the whole process. I'll start from the top left and move across. We've already sort of talked about this sensory memory thing, but here we have stimulus coming in from the left. It goes into our nervous system through our sense organs, and we have that sensory memory process. We attend to it, and you can see if we do successfully attend to something, it moves on to working memory, or what we might call short-term memory. If we don't attend to it, or something comes along and interferes with it, we call that both interference, and we have memory loss. It's gone. We missed it. I wasn't looking out the window when the UPS truck went by, so I missed it. That wasn't what I was attending to. So if I am attending something, I take that information, which is in sensory memory. You can see down below there for just a little bit, but I put that into my short-term or my working memory. This is the active thing I'm thinking about at any given time. It's what I'm presently in my mind, and because that's why we call it working memory. I'm actually thinking about it. And so above that, what you see is if I'm trying to learn this information, you think of, when let's say you're in a classroom and the instructor says something amazing, and you're like, this is life-changing. So you then engage in a process of what we generally refer to as rehearsal, but it applies to any strategy that you have for moving information, or what we call encoding information, into long-term memory. Mark says something amazing and life-changing. I want to remember that. So you might repeat it to yourself. You might run it through your head again. You might write it down when you're taking notes. And just the action of writing it down is a repeat of that particular phrase that is going to change your life, and you just write it down, and that's another way. And you might read it again, and each time you do something with that, and you bring it home later and you put it on your fridge, each one of those things is a part of the rehearsal process. So any study methodology you have fits right into this process that we call rehearsal. Now, again, the person with either sensory problems or attention deficit, one of the problems with attention deficit, for example, is they go to write things down, and while they're focusing on that, they can't switch. So while they're writing, they're missing what is happening next. So taking notes can sometimes be very difficult for someone with attention deficit. And personally, I'm very hard of hearing. So I operate way better if I'm looking at the person who is speaking to me and I can see their lips move. Even though I don't read lips, that's not really a reality. There are cues to help us understand, in my ears, what is sort of vague sounds, and it helps me to understand that, and contextual cues. It's a very hyper-vigilant process for me to hear, and therefore it's a very tiring process for me to hear. Now, I discovered that barrier earlier in my college career because when I was in college and things were zipping along at college rate instead of high school rate, I would go to write something down and I would miss the next thing because I wasn't looking at the person. So this can also be a sensory problem. I don't have attention deficit, I don't think, but I do have a sensory problem. I can't hear very well, and so therefore I miss information if I go to take notes. My adaptation to that was to do it cognitively, and I drew pictures. I would use pictograms. I wouldn't write out lines. I would put pages on it. I'd have the book open, I'd put pages, or I'd highlight in the book, or I'd draw a circle and I'd put other little circles. I'd diagram the information, and then eventually kind of got into the practice of just doing that mentally. And I would just sit in the class and I would just listen. And then I would read a lot and study a lot after, you know, get whatever I could by paying attention. So really, really into that. And so here we have our working memory, and if we don't rehearse well enough, if we don't practice enough, if we don't go over things enough, guess what happens? It's interference again. Goes down and we forget things. If we do encode, it goes into long-term memory, and it's there. But there's still a problem. We have to go find it. And we can maybe use our information processing model to understand this. Have you ever written a file on your computer? You saved it, and the next day, you cannot, for the sake of life, find it. Like, where did I put that? I put it in this folder. It's supposed to be over here. All the logical things. At the time, you probably said, I'm going to put it over here so I don't forget it. And then, there you go. You forgot it. It's there, but there's a retrieval problem. So it is in your head. Just like when you sat down with those exams and you're looking at a question and you're going, I just read this last night, and you just can't get to it. And you keep on trying to figure out what the cues are. In fact, the question itself is a cue. It's like, here's some reminders about what we're talking about, and here's the missing piece, the answer. So tell me what you know. Finish this idea, or pick the right answer that matches this idea. And you're kind of looking for it. They actually do call it tip of the tongue syndrome. When you actually, I know it's right there, I know what this is, and you just can't quite get it. And that's a retrieval process. You actually do have it in your memory, as you have experienced probably. Sometimes you said, I'm not going to get it, I can't remember what it is, or you select the wrong answer in a multiple choice question, and you really kind of winged it, and you walk out, and 10 feet down the hallway, you're like, and it comes to you. And what you probably experienced was some stress, some anxiety related to that question. You got stuck on there, and your own emotional barriers, remember we're talking about the amygdala and all that, started to actually override your system for recall, and therefore you weren't able to do it. You weren't able to perform, pull it out at that time. So here we get to decay. If we don't, I'm sorry, we have retrieval going back. When we retrieve it, we bring it back into working memory, and we can apply it and, you know, mix it around, put it in our own words. Hence, that's why people want you to put things in your own words. It is way different for you just to write something down. If you have to put something, if a teacher asks you to put something in your own words, they're asking you to work on it. They're asking you to put the original thing in your long-term memory, bring it to your short-term memory, and work on it for a bit. Change the words around, put it in your own words. That's actually not so much a testing process, but a rehearsal process. In fact, when you're taking notes, it's actually, taking notes is better than highlighting, because highlighting, it's verbatim. You're just saying this is important stuff. When you're taking notes and you're not quoting, you're actually in the process of putting notes in your own words. And that is a very, very good method of learning, very good method of rehearsal. So that is our process of memory as we understand it graphically. As we understand it in the brain, you saw the graphic a while ago. I mean, it's just, we know that there are parts of the brain associated with memory, but we don't really know how the whole thing comes together. We do know that there's sometimes new neurons, new neuron connections that occur as we're learning, just like the path in the woods. You know, if you keep on sending neurological signals to learn something through that rehearsal process, it's going to create a path in the woods, just like the path you have to the camp outhouse. And pretty soon the path is there for good, and it's easy to find the outhouse. And so the same with memory. When we've done these well-worn paths, they become very, very automatic. Now, and interestingly enough, the parts of the brain associated with procedural memory are very amenable to that. The neurological structures there are very amenable to the creation of very long-standing pathways. Hence, we don't have to relearn how to ride a bike. Hence, we get into trouble when we switch from an automatic transmission to a standard transmission when we go for the brake and we think it's the clutch, that kind of thing. So procedural memories are easier to get down like that. Again, let's go all the way back to the beginning. Procedural, actually motion, hands-on, body kinesthetic kind of learning for some people is very easy because they're working in parts of their brain that make those pathways really clear. So the rehearsal process really does encode well into long-term memory to the point that it can become automated. So if you think about learning an instrument, let's say, and you're learning scales on a guitar, and you practice them over and over and over and over until your fingers bleed and you hate guitar and all that stuff. But get through that, and then pretty soon, your fingers are automatic. In fact, there's probably very little brain processing going on, and I've played with enough musicians to know that that's the case. In fact, it sort of explains why some musicians, really, really, really great musicians, can play while they're intoxicated or on drugs or something like that, because their procedural memory is so there. It's still sad, and the performance is still oftentimes less than it could be, as much as there have been people who have been inspired to perform incredibly that way. But ultimately, the person's impaired, but you can see them playing the song because they played the song, 500 times. So, interesting way to think about procedural memory. Now, here's Dory, and as you can probably tell, I'm sort of a Disney, Pixar person, and Dory suffered from short-term memory loss. And what that means is that, and we see it in the movie, because Dory would be talking to someone and then would become distracted. So she lost her ability to continue with the conversation. Now we know that Dory had long-term memory because, at the end of the movie, she sort of has, it all kind of connects and she comes back in. But her learning deficit is really in short-term memory. She could sense things around her, in fact, maybe too much. She was a little bit of ADHD going on. She'd be distracted. She's doing these kinds of things. But she could be in place, and as long as she didn't have to, recall later, she was fine. So she could play the game of hide and seek with the turtles. She could have conversations with Nemo's dad. And but you saw at the beginning, troubles with names and who are you, and those kind of things. So she sort of represented a kind of interesting short-term memory loss. Now, long-term memory, I'm back to in the background. You can see that graphic there. That we have different kinds of long-term memory, and we organize information into categories, much the way the artist from Pixar organized all of these memories into these large shells. Now, in terms of types of memory, there's what we would call explicit memories, and these are detailed memories. They're about specific things, and those specific things include episodes in our life. This is our autobiographical memory, what we call episodic memories, things that we've experienced and we remember them. And semantic memories, and these are memories that we have of the names of objects like a cup, a table, a computer, a camera, those kinds of things. You can tell what I have in front of me, right? Now, when a person has something, a memory problem like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, these are parts of the memory that are often not affected by that. And so those individuals may still very well, for a while at least, be able to remember past events very clearly. In fact, the damage caused by some of these disorders is that what would be a 10-year-old memory is actually the latest memory that's available, so they may believe that it's actually just happened 10 years ago. So the sad reality of a wife asking where her husband is and why hasn't he visited, and Stan's been dead for 10 years. And that's really, really difficult to deal with. But that's that person's latest memory, which they perceive of as yesterday. Stan was still around. And so these remain very much intact, and even later almost to the end in Alzheimer's, they can still understand semantic memory. These are very solid memories in terms of the names of objects, not people, but the names of objects such as table, chair, and whatnot. And I don't know, I guess I'm trying to figure out, just as I sit here, why people's names would not have that same sort of semantic quality to them. But it might be connected to the amygdala in terms of there's emotions associated with those individuals, and that might deteriorate. I'm just guessing. It's a great research paper. Now, some more ways in which we have long-term memory. We have implicit memories, and these include procedural memories, how we've done something, how we actually accomplish a task, and emotional memories. Now, these are memories that they sort of have a generic quality to it. So it's like, say, in procedural memories, we might you've experienced this, I know. We might understand, let's say, how to do something. Let's say ride a bike, okay? And we call them implicit instead of explicit because I'm not stuck using that memory just to ride my bike. I can switch to a different bike. I can switch to a very different bike, and I can look for aspects of that procedure that are the same, and I can get in there and do it. A very experienced pilot, could probably sit in a lot of different airplanes and look around and kind of get it and be able to fly that aircraft because they get the sense of it. It's an implicit procedural memory. It could be adapted to changing circumstances. Emotional memories are the same thing. Now I'll tell you one of mine. It's a sensory memory, but the smell of dirt that's just been tilled, like in a garden, is a very, very strong trigger for me for a very, very interesting, kind of really difficult, but very pleasant experience of when I was a kid and I used to participate in the potato harvest. Now, as much as that was just horrible labor for really long hours and really low pay, it was very fun because we did it with our friends, and it was just lots of stories about those things. And those the sensory smells bring me right back to that emotional place, and I can feel those emotions everywhere. So this is also the PTSD thing. If I was traumatized while I was picking potatoes, well, I thought I was then, but clearly I wasn't. But if I was traumatized by that, this smell of fresh dirt might actually elicit emotions that are inappropriate for the time and would be very disabling, and that would be a problem. But I'm lucky; it wasn't that bad. And but emotional memories had that sort of generic ability to them. The favorite song comes on. Really doesn't matter who you're with. you get that sort of feeling related to that song, or in a group of people and like, oh, it's like junior high dance again, or something like that. These kind of strong emotional memories that sort of, regardless of what's going on around you, you can still have those kinds of memories. Okay, so now an exciting part of our journey through understanding our memories, and this is really, it has to do with all aspects of our long-term memory. Each one of those memories, some are more affected by these processes than others. It is particularly relevant to our episodic or autobiographical memory. And what it is the constructivist theory of memory. Now, the constructivist theory of memory, just like the graphic implies, is that we build it, we create it. So it is not a recording. It's not an objective recording of our lives. Our memory is not an objective recording of our lives. For you Star Trek fans out there, yes, Data's memory was submittable in court as evidence, irrefutable evidence. However, our memory is not. It can be challenged. We can be asked what our motivations are. We can say that we were not paying attention. We could say that we missed things, and all of those things are true. And eyewitness testimony is actually not a very good source of evidence. Get that. I saw him do it. Not a good view of that. It's not good evidence. Other evidence, particularly forensic evidence and those kinds of things, are much more powerful in court because the attorney on the other side is going to attack the character of the witness, what they were doing at the time, they were stressed, how good was their memory at that process. And what it really talks about is this fact that we construct our memories. In fact, there's some people will say that aside from peak events, and I'm stealing that and using it a different way from Maslow's theory, but peak experiences, really, really important ones, we tend to remember those. Those tend to go right in there and we remember them very well. We might add things to them over time, but we remember those pretty well. The day-to-day memories, when we're kind of recalling things, and we know that we can do that, sometimes we can remember something, a car goes by and you get this vivid memory of when you were 7 and you had the little Matchbox cars that look just like that, and you get this really rich memory and you're like, wow. In fact, there's a large portion of that memory that you're looking at that point, that you've retrieved from long-term memory, it's now in short-term memory again, was constructed by you and never happened. Parts of it might have happened, but a lot of it probably didn't. And you're just filling in. In fact, each time you replay that story, you're repainting, putting a new picture up. You're just formulating that memory. Each time we work on it, it becomes more and more of our own, and therefore is more subject to that construction part. And you can add and subtract pieces from those memories. In fact, it's probably one of the reasons why experts need to remain updated on their information in their fields, because we can sometimes incorporate information for so long that we begin to change it. And it just becomes a truism. And I've actually been called out on that in class. I can't remember what concept it was, but I ended up teaching this concept in class that I had heard about years and years ago. And by the time it got to my 25th class teaching this concept, it had become my own and it had become different. And I was challenged on that, and I went and looked it up. And in fact, the clear memory that I had about that concept had in fact been changed by my own memory construction process. So I have to keep updated on things all the time. So here we have a nice graphic of a construction site, and I want to explain some of the terms that are involved in the construction of our memory. One of them is assimilating, and its companion, accommodating. Now, what assimilating and accommodating refer to is the work of Jean Piaget, famous Swiss psychologist that we'll talk about when we talk about developmental psych. And this individual came up with a cognitive theory called genetic epistemology, qualitative changes in a person's thinking as they age. Well, what he identified is that as children and throughout our lives, we assimilate new information and we build schemas. These are sometimes early on, they're simplistic, but they can become increasingly complex concepts or internal representations of these ideas. So the first time I experience a car, it goes in and there's a sort of like basic template for a car. And then as I get older and I experience different kind of cars or different uses of that word, that concept becomes, as I'm accommodating more information, that becomes increasingly complex and rich. But at the same time, I start separating out and accommodating, taking and changing things about that memory in order to take into account other information, like things that aren't cars, like trucks, backhoes, snowmobiles, motorcycles, you know, and all those things. Whereas very young, I might have grouped those all together as just, you know, transportation things. And so it would be a process of assimilating and accommodating. So we're ongoing doing that all the time. As you learn things in this class or in your other classes and you have increasingly complex ideas, they become fine-tuned, move this out, bring this in, sort of process. You can actually see visually the way that's a construction process. Now, some more processes going on. We can create false memories to fill in the blanks. If we have a memory of a certain thing and it feels like a concert, we might put a band in there. And it might not be the band that was there. And we may encounter that sometimes when we get together with our friends and like, hey, do you remember that Blue Oyster Cult concert? And they're like, what Blue Oyster Cult concert? You know, the one we went to in Presque Isle. And like, that wasn't Blue Oyster Cult. That was Van Halen. No, it wasn't. And you get into this whole thing. Well, one of you has the wrong band. Maybe both of you. Might be because of what you're doing in the car before. I don't know. But anyway, you don't have... we can create false memories. And this, is, of course, is a very important concept when we're dealing with individuals in therapy who may be motivated very much to create memories that explain their experiences, and the tendency for therapists to focus on particular themes within memories can lead to there have been some instances where an individual's clear recollection of something actually proved to be impossible. The individual was in another country at the time or something like that. So where did that memory come from? It was created. Another different story. Sorry, I kind of went ahead on that. People are going to have different stories of what they have. This can be motivated. I put that word in the little red square. I hope you can see my words appearing on here. You have motive. We can be motivated to make something look good, make something look bad, to change the circumstances, maybe to make our reactions better, or like, I never said that. I wouldn't say that kind of thing when in fact you did. We edit. We actually edit. I pressed the wrong button here. Edit. You see up there in those pieces, we're taking things out, putting things in, we're adding things to our memory, and finally we end up with my version. This is my story, becomes the reality. So a little spooky to think that when you think about your life, again, not the major event. It's not like you're going like, oh, you're not my brother? That'd be pretty major. But the linkages between them, a lot of that stuff is you created those things. And so it's important to recognize that they're not 100% accurate. Problems with memory that occurred. Okay, we're going to take a look at that graphic again. And let's look at just some ways that come in here. So we have sensory problems. I talked about my hearing loss. People who don't see, people who have tactile defensiveness, people who are cold, people who are too hot. Any one of those things can interfere with focusing our attention on the stimuli coming in. We can have interference such as distraction, things going on in our life, loud sounds. We're in an environment that doesn't support our learning, is not conducive to learning. We don't have the materials that we need, all the ways in which performance can be impacted by the fact that we just can't find a place or the tools to get our job done. We can have conditions similar, you know, it's on a continuum. We can have a little bit or a lot of ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and that can interrupt with our ability to focus our attention on what needs to be when other distractions are there. So it's part of distraction is that idea. Can I get easily distracted, or can I really conscientiously try and focus on what's in front of me? I cannot, just specifically did not put enough time into something. I just did not study enough, work on it enough. I didn't rehearse it enough. I didn't have that thing in my working memory long enough for it to move into long-term memory. And of course, I could have poor methods as well. I could spend, and this is actually probably important to talk about a little bit, is I know people have heard, I hear it all the time, you know, I worked on this for 9 hours. There is no assignment in this class that you should ever work that long on. You're obviously not doing this in the most efficient way. And that's really not working to your benefit. In fact, working on something for that long, and I kind of question maybe if that's even accurate, but working on something for that long just leads to frustration. You know, it's the person that keeps on pushing on the door to get in when they don't realize that it's a pull door. You know, it doesn't matter how long you do it. You're doing it wrong. So that way it doesn't move. The door doesn't move. You haven't read the sign. There's a classic Gary Larson cartoon like that too. But anyway, and that's when you need to seek help. You need to not work that long on something because the frustration just builds, because the emails I get are, you know, why are you traumatizing me with this assignment? And I'm not. You're traumatizing yourself. And so it's very important to understand. In fact, a part of metacognition, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, is looking at the task at hand and examining the ways that you can approach that with the most efficient for learning. Do you have all the right tools? Do you need help? You need someone to just take the next step? Those kinds of things, so that you don't build up that frustration. We can also have poor cues to help us remember. Now, we might not remember, we might not have studied, but this is the bad question. This is the bad cue. This is, I don't have enough information about what I'm asked to do in order to retrieve the information that I have. So we can sometimes look at the test. Now, it can be a test, or it can be, you know, you have to come up with something. Let's say you've memorized a poem, but then in the situation in which you're supposed to recite that poem, you have stress, people are around you, there's lights, there's all of that stuff, just like a performer. I'll use that because I have experience with that. You can practice a song all you want, but then you're playing it in front of, you know, however many people, and you got the stage fright and stuff like that, and it might interfere with your ability to recall that information and bring it back into memory. And finally, we have decay, the use it or lose it thing. If we stop studying, we stop looking at things, and we just get in a rut kind of thing, we can sometimes lose that. This you know, tons of stuff you could probably imagine, things you used to know how to do, and now you'd have to refigure it out all over again. I sometimes go back, and I kept some, not a lot, but some of my papers that I wrote back when I was an undergraduate, and like, I was really smart at one time. I don't know if I could write that good. I have to learn to do that all over again. But, you know, I did things, and I was in chemistry and calculus and stuff, and like, wow, I used to know that. But I don't have any use to use that anymore. Statistics, for example. You know, I took lots of statistics, did lots of statistics, and in every degree that I had, I took statistics classes. But boy, do I have to relearn that to teach it. Now that I'm teaching statistics here at KV, I've had to relearn the processes that I had down earlier, because I lost it. I didn't use it, so therefore I lost it. Okay, other aspects, I'm going to go through this rather quickly here. Other aspects of our learning processes, life choices that we make These are important. Just take some notes on these things about how you can become a better learner and a more positive experience in school and in life. Who are you hanging around with? Who are you spending your time with? Do they want you to be successful? Are they barriers to success? Are you worried about their success and not your success to a certain degree? Do they actually want you to fail? We have to pick the people that we're with very carefully. What do you engage in terms of activities? What about drugs and drinking? These, of course, interfere with learning, interfere with life, and ultimately fatal. Too much partying instead of studying. And financial choices. These are things that people engage in and do that promote their learning, promote their ability to remember things. What kind of activities, your partying life. There's nothing against having fun, but there's always balance with that. Are you getting things done so you can have fun? There's a nice little bumper sticker for you. So there's those things can obviously impact the way we learn. The next category here is trauma and events, things that are going on. Can't do much about past trauma, but what we do with those things are important, what we do with those memories. How are we managing our stress? Stress is, we often talk about stress like it's a disease, like I have a lot of stress going on. That's really not the way to think about that. You might have a lot on your plate, and that might mean you have to prioritize and get rid of some stuff, and maybe you're saying yes too often, and there's all kinds of ways to deal with how many things are on your plate. But stress management is what needs, it's the thought processes that go into thinking about your responsibilities and these things that are happening to you and how important they are, and perfectionism and things like that. How we actually manage our stress and how we think about it is going to be as important as to whether it's there or not. Getting help. If you start to experience extreme stress about an assignment or an extreme stress about something in your environment or your job, get help. You can't really fly alone on some of these things. You really need an outside perspective, and accept the fact that even though you have an extremely good perspective because you're involved in a situation, it's probably wrong because it's personal. And you need to be able to open up to the notion that my perspective is off because I'm too close to this situation. I need somebody from the outside to kind of give me some guidance. And that not only getting help also then enables you to help others. And it's in that order, by the way. You get help, and then you have the ability to help others. Too many times we get that backwards. I'm going to help others, and that will help me. And that doesn't last. That's just not a very sustainable sort of thing to do. We want social supports around us. It goes back to who we're hanging around with. Hang around with positive people. Get rid of all those people that are negative influences in your life. And how do we deal with strong emotions? The PTSD stuff, or the things we're really angry about and frustrating. And again, this is really where therapy comes in. Therapy is not going to eliminate the trauma. It's not going to eliminate stress. It's not going to give you social supports, although therapists represent part of your social support team. These are skills on what do I do when I'm feeling these things in the moment. How do I breathe? How do I relax? How do I focus? How do I center myself? Those kinds of things. These are practices that therapists are experts at in helping you with. The next set here is memory tricks that we have. A little bit lighter content here, but here we have memory tricks that include chunking information together that's related information. You can sometimes do this between class. If you're taking biopsychology and A&P at the same time, wow, you're both learning about the eye, then you're learning about the brain, then you're learning about the ear, and there's all kinds of ways to bring that information together. But even even when it's not that clear, you might hear, I'll talk about neurotransmitters in here, but you hear that in your A&P class. And you can kind of chunk information across different classes. And that's when the magic starts to happen. When you can start to see how all your classes are related to each other, that's a really, really cool place to be academically. We can elaborate on things. We can overlearn. This is my actual favorite way to learn. You might only need A, B, and C for the test. But if you learn A, B, C, D, E, and F, then A, B, C you got down. In fact, that tests become easy because you learn so much about it. This is the development of expertise. There are things that I've studied for a long, long, long time that if you put a question in front of me, it's kind of like, well, yeah. I don't even have to work on thinking about that. That's almost automated, like scales on a guitar. And so you overlearn things in ways, and it takes a little bit more time, but then it's the pathway to mastering that information, and particularly in the courses that, I think it should be applied to all courses, but particularly in the courses where there's knowledge that you're going to have to apply in the real world. Overlearn it. Overlearn it, and that's how you would develop expertise. And spaced practice, this is something that I learned when I went to music school. This is when I learned it, like really learned it. I've always known about it. I studied psychology as an undergraduate, but I crammed everything. I wrote papers the night before they were due. I crammed for exams. The pressure actually helped my learning. That was unique to me. It's not unique to everybody. I went to music school and tried to do the same thing and hit the wall. Was not able to do that. I'm not that good of a musician to cram things in. I had to practice. If I was going to practice 5 hours a week, 1 hour a day was better than 5 hours on Friday. It was just better, even though it was the same amount of time over the course of the week. And so spacing out your practice, spacing out your rehearsal, spacing out your study time, studying all day, you can try it and see if it works, but understand that science really sort of tells us that spaced practice is a better way to approach learning. And finally, mnemonics. We have mnemonics. These are songs or acronyms that we use to remember things, and of course our world is full of acronyms right now, so we sometimes we don't even know what the acronyms mean. So IBM is recognized by everybody, but does everybody know it's International Business Machines? Or Geico, that's a good one. The Geico's just become this sort of thing, and it's the Government Employees Insurance Company. That's what Geico stands for. So we remember, we don't, mnemonics have become so clear and so much part of our memory system that we sometimes know companies we know things just by their mnemonic without having to know what the mnemonic stands for. We're going to look at time management, and I think we actually do a little bit. I'm going to put these all up here because I think all of them are important. Scheduling time, prioritizing, and scheduling relaxation. Let me elaborate on this a little bit. Check my time here. I have a class coming up. We've been told to set aside and schedule study time. And the problem with that is that if I schedule 2 hours tonight to get something done that I have to get done for class, what if it takes longer than 2 hours? Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. So here's what you have to kind of do. What you have to do is schedule everything else. You schedule time with your kids. You schedule time to do your chores. You schedule time for work. Schedule time for play. Schedule time to go out with your friends. Do all that. And of course, because you're going to have to need a lot of time to study, you have to shrink those down, put them close together, so you have these wide open spaces to do your work, particularly early in your career when you're not quite sure how long it is going to take you to do this thing. You might, and librarians tell me this all the time. They'll go into the library, I need to do a research paper, I need to find 5 articles. When is it due? Monday, and it's Friday. Not enough time. You might be able to pull it off I did. You might be able to pull it off, but it's not the best way for learning. And it's really kind of scheduling that time, particularly, let's say, discussions with all these online courses right now. There are individuals contacting me that their internet went out on the day they were going to do something, like participate in the discussion. So that's cool. I get that. Disappointing, but you had all week to do it. So it's a prioritization. So what you did is you scheduled your schoolwork, and then you did other things. It's the opposite. Schedule the other things, and all the other time is dedicated to schoolwork, because you don't know how long it's going to take to finish those things. So I'm going to suggest that you do that. And then when you get something done, reward yourself with one of those things that you put aside. Like I'm not watching as much Star Trek as I used to. So when I get this paper done, I'm going to binge like 4 or 5 of those, and that would be my reward for getting that paper done. So it's all about scheduling your relaxation time, like I have in the graphic here, prioritizing your work, and scheduling the the important things, family time, scheduling all of that, scheduling your work that you make money at and stuff like that, and get that. And then everything else is for school. All the other time is for school. So it's probably a better way to approach time management than scheduling school time. And when you're studying, organize your information. Don't have this scattered all over the place. A binder for each course, a folder for each assignment. Limit your need for perfection. No one will know. No one will know except you. Strive for it all you want. You want perfection, but it's not the goal. The goal is to know things and to be able to apply them and be flexible. That's what we look for in an educated person. So this idea of I want to get straight 100s, you might want to let that go. New expectations for being in college versus when you're in high school. A lot of your education is up to you right now. And of course, metacognition, which is think about approaches you have to learning and what is the best approach to this particular topic that you have. You have a discussion that's due. What's your best approach for scheduling to get that done? You have a paper to do on a topic you don't know anything about. What's your best approach for doing that? Might be different than the approach you're taking to learn a new math formula. You can't be grunt learning the whole thing. You have to be precise. You have to be knowledgeable. And just that exercise of metacognition will be helpful in terms of your ongoing career. Okay, we're at the end of our chapter. All of that life-changing information. You then report out to me some examples of when you've assimilated and accommodated new information in the discussion. We have a quiz on the brain parts associated with memory. And we have an assignment where you're going to tell me about a few examples of engaging in metacognition. Now, this paper that you're going to write is going to consist first of a title page. Make sure you put the title page, 10 points on that just for the title page. Your current major and your plans, meaning what are you going to do when you graduate, and all that, little paragraph about that. I want you to tell me about your past learning and the strategies that you've learned. That's just a single paragraph. This is what I've done in the past in terms of learning information that I was, wasn't coming easy, so I had to make effortful activity happening. And then I want 3 examples of things you're doing at KV right now where you think you have to adjust your plan. I was working, you might say I work with flashcards all the time, but that wouldn't work in my class. I'm not asking for vocabulary. So you might say, how do I approach Kavanaugh's class with when my best tool is taken away from me. I can't use flashcards. So how would you approach that? And you want to look in the course book and the textbook about learning activities and what space practice, looking at the mnemonics, creating, there's a method called a method of loci that I used to use all the time. I didn't know what it was called then, but placing information on the walls around the room kind of thing, and you memorize where they are. So you kind of make the connection through classical conditioning. Oh, the stuff on the fridge, that was that particular biology of the mitochondria. I put that on the fridge. So you can remember it because it was on the fridge, and you move around the room that way. I learned the Krebs cycle that way. I had that around my dorm room. And so you write that paper up, submit that, and that's the expectations for Chapter 8. So I hope this has been helpful. It's been really long, and I actually started this video out for it to be really short, but there's just too much good information to get out there. So enjoy this week. We have next week off for spring break, so give it your all, and then you can rest up next week, and I will see you online.